آقای حمید صبی هستم. ایشون وکیل دادگستری و عضو کمیته اجرایی. آقای حمید صبی سخنران بعدی ما هستند. ایشان وکیل دادگستری و عضو کمیته اجرایی تریبونال بین‌المللی درباره جنایات جمهوری اسلامی هستند و در این کارزار نقش بسیار برجسته‌ای داشتند. ما خیلی خوشحالیم که صحبت‌های ایشون رو در مورد این تجربه مهم در اختیار ما بگذاریم.
Thank you. I've been asked to deliver my paper in English, so my apologies for those who are not English speaking, so please put your headphones on. My name is Hamid Sabi. I'm an Iranian lawyer but practicing in London, and I've had the honor to be associated with Iran Tribunal over the last 3 years in connection with its major initiative of setting up this People's Tribunal. 25 years ago, at the beginning of summer, prisoners in Evin prison started receiving Morse code messages through the pipework of the prison. The message revealed the arrival of a commission to decide on prisoners' fate. Some received the message with anticipation and hoping that this will end in their release. Somehow message had gone that there is the Imam's Pardons Committee, so that made some hopeful, but most of the prisoners remained skeptical. It was not long before prisoners finally find out that what the committee was about, and by that time it was too late. In summer of 1988, political prisoners who have survived the horrific period of torture and terrible prison conditions were brought before a committee which was later nicknamed as the Death Committee. The Evin Prison Committee consisted of Nayeri, an Islamic judge, so he claims, Ishraqi, and Pur Mohammadi, who is now the Minister of Justice in Rouhani's government. Prisoners were given 2 or 3 minutes to respond positively or negatively to the questions of the committee as to whether they believed in the Islamic Republic of Iran, whether they were prepared to defend the Islamic Republic of Iran, and if necessary walk on landmines, or even to execute their comrades who had become wayward and lost their ways. Nobody was warned as to the purpose and the consequence of these questions. Some lucky prisoners, unwittingly, gave responses that saved their life, but the majority remained steadfast and did not concede to the brutal demands of the regime to recant their previous beliefs. Similar committees were set up in other prisons across Iran. By the end of September 1988, at least 5,000 prisoners had been hanged, the only charge being they did not believe in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The massacre of prisoners in 1988 was the culmination of a decade of bloodshed, torture, execution, rape, and mistreatment of prisoners, resulting in the elimination of the opposition groups of the regime. This was the most brutal suppression of the political opposition in life of Islamic Republic of Iran. At least 250,000 were incarcerated for their political beliefs in 1980s. They were routinely tortured, and thousands died under torture or as a consequence of infections and diseases that they contracted. At least another 25,000 were executed between 1981 and 1983. Those who survived received long-term prison sentences, some of which were for minor offenses, such as being sympathetic to an opposition group, even though some of these organizations, like Mujahideen, were legally organized at the beginning of the regime and at the time that these people were their sympathizers. Those who served their term were not allowed to be released until they provided either a guarantor or signed documents that they will not oppose the regime in the future. As such, they were kept in terrible conditions in Iran's vast network of prisons until their fate was decided by the Death Committee. By 1988, and cessation of hostilities between Iran and Iraq, the world was tired of listening to Iran and the antics of its regime. The international community was more interested in reaching a rapprochement with the Islamic Republic of Iran and renew its trade with a rich country that had been devastated by 8 years of war and was prepared to pay billions in restructuring the country's infrastructure. For whatever reason, the international community remained silent in response to the report of the massacre of political prisoners. Reports of Amnesty International and other human rights organizations, which showed the depth and extent of atrocities, fell on deaf ears. Reynaldo Galindo-Pol, and later his successor, Maurice Capiton, who were Special Rapporteur for Human Rights Commission at the time, received many reports of these atrocities, but they tended to class them as an over-exaggeration and preferred the version of Islamic Republic of Iran that some had been killed during the attack by Mujahideen under the operation entitled Eternal Light. The survivors and families of the victim, and in particular the group now known as Khavaran Mothers, continued with their campaign. The campaign was suppressed in Iran, and the visits by the mothers and relatives to Khavaran were dispersed using brutal force. Eventually, campaign groups were established outside Iran, in Sweden, Germany, and elsewhere. The campaign, having failed to attract international support, decided to set up its own tribunal. And thus, the Campaign for Iran Tribunal became into existence in 2007. In February 2011, an international legal steering committee was established in order to set up the tribunal. I had the honor of being a member of that committee, and I later joined the executive committee of Iran Tribunal. The committee decided to divide the process into two stages, a fact-finding process called the Truth Commission and a judicial process called Iran Tribunal. The fact-finding commission was set up with 6 commissioners, all international human rights figures. It was chaired by Maurice Capiton, a former rapporteur of human rights on Iran, who by now decided that he owed it to the survivors and relatives of the political prisoners to establish the facts. The commission held its sessions in London in June 2012 at the Human Rights Action Center of Amnesty International. 75 witnesses gave evidence to this commission, relaying the horrific stories that had remained suppressed for more than 2 decades. The commission report was published in July 2012 and is an indictment of Islamic regime's conduct during this period. This is the report, some 400 pages with the evidence of all the 75 witnesses and the report of the commission that runs into some 66 pages. The report deals with the details of arrest, harassment of families during the arrest, the midnight calls, the brutal force that was used by simply detaining unarmed individuals. Invariably, the prisoners were systematically and brutally tortured. Some prisoners were arrested with their infant child. Azar gave a moving testimony as to how her child was crying in the arms of her interrogator when she was receiving lashes by her torturers. Some 60 forms of torture were reported by prisoners. These were physical as well as psychological tortures. Prisoners were forbidden to assist and help the tortured prisoners and were either in their deathbed suffering from horrendous injuries received as a consequence of torture or needing medical assistance. One of the witnesses said that Islamic Republic did not only kill humans, but also killed humanity in the prisons. Most prisons were overcrowded, and in some cells, prisoners had to wait for their turn to be able to lie down and have a short period of sleep. Some had to sleep while standing. Some of them could not stand because they had been lashed at the sole of their feet. A prison cell fit for 2 or 3 prisoners would house some 25 people. They were either sitting or sleeping or standing at the top of each other. After completion of the investigation, and if the poor prisoners survived the torture, the prisoners were brought before a religious judge. The courtroom was invariably inside the prison compound. The prisoners did not have any access to lawyers or legal representation. The hearings lasted 2 to 5 minutes. In most cases, the prisoners were not allowed to defend themselves. The prison officials, the prosecutors, and the judges were more or less of the same fabric. There is evidence that judges ignored responses from the prisoners. Some judges were rude to the prisoners, and there were evidence that some of the judges even beat up the accused during the process. The stories of torture and mistreatment of the prisoners goes to many pages. Each of the witnesses described in detail how themselves or their relative was tortured and punished for slightest misdemeanor in their eyes. The report concludes, and I would read the closing remark of the report. The Commission concludes that these violations of human rights were devised, instigated, and executed or caused to be executed by a single central authority, and as such the government of Islamic Republic of Iran is the only authority responsible for these acts. The facts reported by the Commission have been committed by state officials, judges, prosecutors, prison officials, torturers, and interrogators. Because they are state agents, it follows that Iran itself bears international responsibility under Articles 2001 on responsibility of states for wrongful act, which have acquired the status of norm of international customary law. The tribunal's report was then submitted to the Commission's report, was submitted to the tribunal that was sitting in The Hague in October 2012. Before that, in September 2012, the Commission served copies of the report together with a letter inviting the Islamic Republic of Iran to participate in the hearings in The Hague. Unfortunately, the Islamic Republic refused to participate. The tribunal in The Hague was established under the presidency of Judge Johan Kriegler, a former president of the Constitutional Court in South Africa during the transition period. Other important figures such as Michael Mansfield QC, John Dugard from South Africa, Patricia Sellers, sat as judges in this tribunal. During the 3 days hearing, further evidence was heard from witnesses of fact and also experts. The tribunal then issued its final judgment on 5th February 2013, condemning the government of Iran for its gross violation of rights of its citizens and crimes against humanity. I would read some passages on the closing remark of the tribunal's decision. Murder. Documentary video showed the graves of executed prisoners stretching out as far as the eye can see. The gravedigger of Shiraz reported the delivery of 60 bodies on a single occasion, of victims at most 20 years old. Men were arrested at 10 in the morning and dead by 11. Entire families were eliminated. Whole wards were purged. Rows of prisoners were shot by firing squad, still breathing until they were finished off by coups de grace. Child prisoners were required to administer these coups de grace. Truckloads of bodies were tipped into mass graves. Minors were murdered. In no case was an execution ordered in accordance with due process. In 1988, pursuant to the fatwa issued by Khomeini, over 5,000 prisoners were killed, mostly by hanging, over a space of few months. Torture. Torture was routinely carried out in all prisoners. There was not one witness who was not tortured in prison, both physically and mentally. Prisoners were hanged from ceiling by their arms, and the soles of their feet were flogged. Prisoners were beaten, deprived of sleep, kept in solitary confinement, subjected to mock execution, and forced to watch other prisoners being tortured or were tortured in the presence of their children. Persecution. Kurds, Arabs, Baha'is, and political groups were targeted. The Baha'is were denied protection. The Constitution deliberately excluded them from a class of protected minorities, which meant they could be killed with impunity. Their holy sites, including the House of Bab, was razed. Their homes were set ablaze. Sexual abuse. There has been widespread and systematic sexual abuse of women and men in prisons. Female prisoners were raped before their execution. They were forced to marry interrogators or revolutionary guards. They were raped or sexually abused to break their resistance to and extract confession. Degrading and inhuman treatment. Victims were detained for long periods without trial. Prisoners were charged with vague political offenses at hearings lasting an average a couple of minutes, during which they were blindfolded and verbally and physically assaulted. None of the victims was ever given access to any defense counsel of any sort. Prison cells were overcrowded, medical assistance was withheld, prisoners were forced to participate in religious indoctrinations. They faced mock executions. Families of victims were subjected to cruel treatment. They were forced to pay for the bullets used to shoot their loved ones. They were assaulted when they tried to hold mourning services. Gravestones were smashed, and mass brutal sites were covered with tarmac. This is the first time that a state has been held responsible for crimes against humanity. Up to now, individuals who had committed crimes against humanity were brought before national, or in the last 10 years before ICC, and tried for crimes against humanity. In this particular case, with a substantial evidence showing that the government of Iran was complicit in all these tortures, murders, without any legal foundation, and therefore the tribunal considered that the Islamic regime being at the center of decision-making for these atrocities, and not only condoned but actively participated in the elimination of its political opponents, and is guilty of crimes against humanity. This has been a very difficult period for me and for those who participated, but more than anyone else, for witnesses like the ones you have heard and you will hear today, who had to come forward and bravely tell their stories to international community. The impact of this tribunal has been tremendous. The Truth Commission process was followed by at least 200,000 people, mostly in Iran. The tribunal in The Hague was followed by up to 900,000 people, again mostly in Iran. It has received massive media and international response, and we hope with your participation this will continue. This will continue, and we will not forget the crimes that have been committed. We will not condone it, we will not support it, we will continue to fight until the day that those who had committed these crimes are brought before a fair and just tribunal and tried. Thank you.